Welcome to the datacenterHawk podcast. I'm Mike Netzer, joined as always by datacenterHawk founder and president David Liggitt. David, how are you this morning?
I'm feeling great, Mike. How are you?
The redness from your face has subsided since our suffering earlier today.
It's terrible.
I know.
What a great way to start this
Hey, you know what we're talking
podcast.
about today? It's a buzzword. It's called hyperscale.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm calling this the hyperscale evolution. So as we think about hyperscale, that's a term that many people know.
Yes.
And as many people know, this podcast is hopefully educational and informative for you as you are listening. Just know, if we haven't mentioned it before, we have a ton of other information. We actually did a whole series on hyperscale a couple years ago that is kind of evergreen content, just to kind of orient you to the ins and outs of the hyperscale data center space. And obviously, a ton more information on our website. We'd love to connect with you there, datacenterHawk.com.
Yes.
But for today, we're going to talk about the hyperscale evolution and how those groups have changed over the last 10, 15 years.
Yes.
And as most people know, they are the elephant in the room when it comes to the data center space. We'll kind of talk about some of the statistics behind that. But it's groups that people are very intent on understanding how they operate.
Yes.
Given the large impact they have on the space.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd start with really just defining what are we talking about when we say hyperscale. So
Go ahead.
If you think through, the entire universe of data centers, right? All data centers, globally, whatever. And you kind of split that into two groups.
Yes.
One group being what we might call colocation, or groups that are building data centers to lease them to other people. The other group would be groups that are building data centers for their own use, or self-building, self-performing, have whatever your term du jour is. Within that group that is building data centers for themselves, you have banks, hospitals, government agencies, technology companies, and a subset of that group are the ones that are building at large scale, or hyperscale, as we might say. That's where the term comes
there
from.
It
yes.
is.
So, what may have 5, 10 years ago may have been 10, 20, 30 megawatt data centers now is gigawatt campuses.
Yeah.
And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how we've gotten there. So when we talk about that and you apply that definition, that measure, you're talking about probably 10 to 15 companies.
Yes.
And really probably 5 or so that are even distinct within that group that are doing building data centers at the largest of scales.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the definition we'll be working from today. So let's talk a little bit about how this group really came to be and how they evolved kind of into kind of some distinct eras. I think if you use broken out, there's kind of some inflection points and growth phases within that group. So talk about really how we got here. What's the initial kind of start of that hyperscale group?
Yeah. And I'd point out before one thing you said that I think is a good reminder, which is our space is unique in that it is the largest demand comes from a small amount of users. And so, it differs from other commercial real estate asset classes in that way. There's not, and there's typically smaller amounts of large requirements in a market, in the office market or in the industrial market. But in the data center space, it's
even more pronounced.
Yeah, because of the size and who these companies are. So that's one thing just to, I think, for people that are on the fringe of the industry trying to understand, that's one thing that's really important to understand, because that impacts things like pricing. It impacts on the leasing side. It impacts where they go. There's a lot of different things. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, one of the challenges people have with understanding our space is these 10 to 15 companies and their relationship between self-performance, so going out and buying a piece of land, building on a piece of property, and then operating that property over a time period, and then also leasing capacity. And so there's this relationship between the two. And it's a really important thing to try to get your arms around. And there's a couple things I would mention. One would be, in the 20 years I've done this, questions I get all the time from people that are coming into space, like, what happens if these companies decide they just want to do it themselves? That's a reasonable question. Yeah. We just haven't seen that. In fact, we've seen the opposite. And I've got the numbers to back it up, Mike.
Oh, do you?
There we
Please,
go.
Do tell.
That's right. We're a numbers company. Here we go. So, and I probably should have gone back further than this, but these are the North American absorption numbers for the last four or 5 years that we tracked. So in 2020, again, this is kind of in the heart of all the pandemic stuff going on. 857 megawatts of leasing, and pre-leasing is included in this in the North American market. 2021, 990 megawatts. 2022, we're going to switch to gigawatts, 2.27 gigawatts. 2023, 4.13, and 2024, 6.79. So you can see the significant increase of leasing that's happened in the space.
And that's primarily driven by the hyperscale groups.
Yeah, absolutely. The hyperscale group is driving that. Now, I will say the enterprise market continues to grow and is certainly not slow, but that is what is driving those numbers to that level. In the same time, these hyperscale companies have been buying land and growing on their own as well. And so I just to kind of maybe level set people's expectations, there's two things happening right now. And I don't really see a significant shift in either. I know there's been some market, news lately about groups maybe changing their approach or whatever. That's pretty normal in the ebbs and flows of the data center space. We've been in a period of time where it's been like grow. And I guess if you're in it for the short term, if you've been here for a little bit and you are, highly, you're paying attention to the news, which is good to do. I think that can be more acute. I think if you look over the long term, some of these announcements and things, once they kind of settle out, you go, okay. And I think that's what we've seen over the last, couple weeks to month of dealing with some of the news that's been in the market around changes on approach. But what I would like to do, Mike, is talk about some of the changes around the hyperscale companies' owned strategy, their self-performance strategy. I would like to identify a few of those, talk about maybe where that is today and what that might look like moving forward. Because I think that's a big part of the market that if you're listening as an investor, you're listening as someone that's trying to sell powered land. We've done podcasts on that. There's an opportunity for you there, but I think understanding the different to be honest, even those that are leasing capacity, those that are data center operators that are going, hey, we want to go buy land and build a campus, and we have the operational know-how to convince these companies to sign a lease with us. This is really important too.
Yeah, when you talk about lease versus build, it's always been a dual strategy, but one of the stats we tracked for a while was kind of that lease versus build kind of dynamic.
Yes.
And so I think this was an interesting stat. So I think in 2017, there was roughly 65 to 70% self-build and 30 to 35% lease.
Okay.
By 2022, that had flipped. It was about 60% lease, 40% build.
Interesting.
And I think you started to see some of those groups get a little behind as some of the demand hit.
Yeah.
They got a little bit behind. And I think in 2024, I haven't run this exactly, but I think it's about 50-50.
Yeah.
It may have even shifted back slightly more to the self-build side.
Because they're
because of some of these massive campuses
that
have been announced.
And you got to think about
that is a kind of constantly evolving stat.
Yeah, and you got to think about the end user. I mean, they have a really, to predict IT capacity, demand and growth today, and then what it's going to be in a year, 2 years, 5 years. I mean, there's so many factors that come into that. The individual company, how they do planning, companies they acquire, growth and density. There's just so many things that play into that I think it's important to realize that's a tricky thing to get right, and it's always changing.
Yeah, and our team has worked really hard to boil all of that down into some very simple, straightforward metrics. But to your point, there is so much that goes into it before a piece of land is acquired, before a lease is signed. It's incredibly complex.
Yep. So here's a couple things that are worth kind of taking away from the hyperscale owned strategy. So number one is the size of, there's been a large increase in the amount of land purchased for data center development by hyperscale companies on their own over the last 4 or 5 years in the U.S. And I don't really see that changing anytime soon. I mean, we've seen, in my great little sheet of paper here, but we've seen, go up from 3,500 acres in 2020, and again, this is not all of the land, but it's most of it. 2021, 4,300 acres. 2022, 5,900 acres. 2023, 14,500 acres. 2024, almost 17,000 acres. So there's just a lot of land being purchased for this type of growth. This will not happen this year. Like the building and construction will not happen this year. It will be over a long time period, but that's certainly worth noting. That's the first thing, the amount of land. Number two, if you're taking notes, is the size of parcels that are being purchased, and the average size. In 2020, it goes basically from 90 acres, 100 acres average to 150 acres to 200 acres. Now we're at 225, 250 acres average on these purchases. And so I think that's really important to note, is that the size of the parcels are getting bigger, which goes back to your strategy on just how large the vision has become for this.
And if I got to issue a point number 3.
Oh, please do.
This is my pastor outline of 3-point sermon here. Okay, so in 2015, those hyperscale users had 2.5 gigawatts of built capacity, with about 71% of that being in the U.S. In 2020, that number would jump to 10.1 gigawatts, 77% in the U.S., and in 2024, it went to 23.4 gigawatts, with 78% in the U.S. Globally, there's still a heavy focus in the U.S.
Yep.
The growth is incredible.
Yeah.
And still, you see pretty hockey stick.
Yeah.
As far as deployed capacity.
Yeah.
Again, still a big focus in the U.S. Obviously, that's growing internationally, but the main area of deployment is still the U.S.
Yeah, and I think actually this brings up, if you think about the U.S., I was reading a state. This sounds so terrible. I was reading a state bill on AI legislation. Don't
this
judge
is the hard work you're doing.
Don't judge me, people.
No. We were reading IRPs. We're reading legislative initiatives.
That's right. One of our team members. So we actually, this is a good little sales pitch or a plug for. We have these regional podcasts we're doing now. So you and I have done a podcast for years and years. Now we have a North America team, our Latin America team, our Europe team, and our APAC team doing podcasts. And I'm telling you right now, these are really good. If you're in these markets, you should listen to them. I listened to one the other day from our team, and I'm learning from them. And so one of the things that was brought up was a state bill that had to do with the self-reporting that the state wants the hyperscale and the large users to do on power usage. And this is not passed yet. Power usage, water usage. A lot of these bills don't get passed. It's part of the
saber rattling.
The negotiating process to get a more an environment that works for data center development. However, it just made me think you've really got to do your homework on where this legislation could go state by state if you're going to go buy land or you're going to go invest in a certain market, because that's a really easy way to shift demand from one market to the other. And we have seen this. We have definitely seen this in certain states across the U.S. where people had bought land, invested in sites, doing the initial site preparation work, and the legislation changes, and it's different day. So, so anyway, okay. So now let's do point 4, Mike.
Lay it on me.
Let's talk about the locations that have shifted
within the U.S.
U.S. Because we've seen a significant shift there, and I just kind of give it probably before the AI stuff, we were seeing you were seeing the hyperscale companies buy land in markets that were data center colocation markets. So in Northern Virginia, there's a couple that have bought a lot of land there, and they were building it on their own. But most of these land purchases where they were owning and operating the sites themselves were in more rural markets. So think about Des Moines, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, Boardman, Oregon, Prineville, Oregon.
You're talking 10 plus years ago.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Boynton, South Carolina, and even up to the last 4 or 5 years, because they're growing in those markets. So they're continuing to invest there, San Antonio, but then areas like Chicago, Atlanta, I mentioned Northern Virginia, Columbus, those markets we're seeing growth too. Now, since then, I think when the demand got really large and the expectations around future growth with the AI got really large, there started to be a whole new world of places that these groups would go. So Temple, Texas, Augusta, Georgia, Indianapolis, Charleston, South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, El Paso, Louisville, Montgomery, Alabama. Those are examples of Boise, Idaho. I'm sorry.
It's also known as anywhere that has power.
That's right.
You can find that on your map.
That's right. That's been a big part of it, and I think that that's worth keeping your eye on as you think about where the opportunities are. Now, there's some risk there. As things move out of larger markets, there's things you have to figure out, including how are you going to build where are you going to get the labor to build a data center of this size? It's not a small. You mentioned the 30 megawatt, like that's a smaller data center today compared to what we're seeing now, but we're talking about 300 megawatts of demand. So it just takes that many more electricians, that many more people to actually do the construction. So I think we're thinking about. Another risk is, hey, the further we get out from these larger cities, how are we going to backfill this capacity if the end user, decides to terminate a lease or to, leave after 10 years? So there's some additional challenges there that you really have to think through. But, think about this. So the amount of land is increasing that they're buying. The parcel sizes are increasing. The markets that they're going to in number are increasing, and in the nature of the places that they're going are very different than they were today.
Yeah. You mentioned those kind of 8 to 10 core markets that existed 10 plus years ago. In 2024, 34 markets in the U.S. that had at least 500 megawatts of kind of built plus planned capacity.
Interesting. I did not know that, Mike. See, I'm telling you, I just need to stay on our podcast.
I can access our website as good as well as the next guy.
That's right.
But that's just indicative of to your point, the spread. And
say that again.
So you mentioned, I think, about 8 to 10.
That's right.
That were kind of hyperscale clusters that existed 10 years ago.
Yes.
I think, again, not the technical expert, but those are more, I almost call those like back office, like kind of like cold storage computing work that those groups were doing.
Yes.
They weren't necessarily serving the end user because they were pretty far distributed.
Yes.
And in 2024, 34 markets where there's at least 500 megawatts either built or planned.
That might be the stat of the podcast right there.
Thank you.
I'd love for one of my stats, but that might be, seriously, that's a really interesting point. The other thing, we did some work on single hyperscale user markets where there's no colocation provider in the market as well. And this is a strategy that you've seen over the last 10 years, which is, hey, if a data center end user, one of these large ones, moves to one of these markets, we should go buy land there too, because there's a chance that if they want to grow, we can get ahead of that and probably be a partner for them. So right now there's almost 10 or 11 markets in the U.S. where there's a single hyperscale user that's growing, probably in the 200, 300, 400 megawatts, and no colocation operator. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 additional ones where there's only one colocation operator. So there's still opportunities. That's 18 to 19 markets, 17, 18 markets that either have no colocation operator or one, next to in close proximity to a hyperscaler that's building. So there's still opportunities for finding areas that you want to, look at the user that is growing there, and maybe look at how they've grown in other markets and apply that same type of growth strategy to that area. And that's not foolproof. I mean, they might say, hey, this is our one facility here, and that's not the case. And you need to understand if it's an AI location or there's cloud availability zones. I think that's one of the areas where providers have really tried to get out ahead of things. If we know that a cloud availability zone strategy needs multiple sites, if we can hang around the rim on the one site that's been purchased and be in close proximity, and there's very specific measurements on how far the sites can be from a latency and mileage perspective. That's a strategy that can work, and it has in certain markets.
Well, and the cool thing is, we've been doing this now a little over 10 years, and you can see that strategy of groups where hyperscale kind of establishes a beachhead, and then the colos kind of come around it like catfish to a light. Around a dock is how I like to see it.
It's a fishing
you ever do that fishing? You ever do that fishing, like light fishing? It's insane.
No.
You put the two groups hang lights off their dock in Florida, at least where I've seen it, and the fish just kind of congregate to it. It's typically catfish, which you don't really want to catch, but so the analogy kind of breaks down. But anyways, so you can look over the last 10 plus years and see how some of these markets have evolved, where there's a large user goes, and then the colo kind of follow. Yep. And a lot of those groups have had a lot of success with that that strategy. Now, there's probably, to your point, a limit, because some of these groups, to your point, they're going to have one big campus, and they know what they need to do there, and there may never be kind of spillover growth, and some there might. And so trying to understand how and why that's happened can really help and kind of inform, if you're looking to capitalize on some of that growth, that can inform that strategy.
Yeah, one last thing I'll say, and we can wrap it up, but I think one of the reasons this has worked, this the leasing and the ownership strategy for the hyperscale user is probably, I would say, like 10 years ago, I think the data center operator community really changed their approach in the way that they worked with these companies. And they really, instead of saying like, this is how you build a data center, we know how to do it, I think they flipped and realized like these companies are doing it. They're doing it too, and they know what they're doing. And in some areas, they're doing it better than we are. We need to listen and understand and go back to them with more of a flexible approach on like, hey, how can we work with you over a long period of time to help you accomplish what you want to accomplish while we're also, able to benefit and meet the returns that we need to meet. And I think it was really that shift that has allowed this growth, has allowed the leasing to grow and the vision of these data center users doing it themselves to grow as well. It never would have happened if the data center operators had just said, hey, this is how you do it, and if you don't want to do it this way, then tough.
Yeah, the Henry Ford approach.
Yeah, and so I think
it's not going to work.
I think you got to give them a lot of credit because they are serving a community. The data center end users that they are building for are experts in what they do. So it's a very, if someone goes to lease a 500,000 square foot office space and they're an insurance company, they're not experts at office building and office efficiency and all these different things. Every data center that one of these large colocation operators builds and leases for these, end users, they're experts at it. And they know what the costs are. They know what the technology to bring into the data center is. They know how, generators work and the efficiency behind them and all those different things. And so I think to be honest, it's a very, I think it's been really interesting to watch, and I think it's a compliment to them on how they've been able to figure that out and grow with them.
Yeah, and it's a situation that continues to change and evolve.
Yeah.
This
that's
podcast is
that's why
evolution.
That's
yes,
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Underscore point you there. But certainly one that we're doing our very best to understand where and why it's happening.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, we hope this podcast has been helpful. Do you want anything else to add?
Sorry, one last thing.
Yeah,
lately we since the beginning of the year we've done more of these podcasts, and it's been fun because I always like spending time with you, Mike, and you, Rhett. But I think we've been getting a lot of feedback, which has been really fun. And we always appreciate the feedback, and I know people will come up to us and tell us, hey, that's awesome, love this, or hey, y'all suck, or whatever. It's cool.
I'll call them.
Yeah, and just we'll refund your
horses
money.
for courses.
Yeah. Oh wait, you don't pay anything. No, just kidding. But I do want to say there are some of those that have been like super supportive, and we are very thankful. In fact, yesterday I was on a call and someone said, hey, I am the third listener other than your mother and someone else. They go, people more than your mom listen to your podcast. Anyway, it was a very funny comment. I appreciate it. So
as far as I know, my mom has still never listened.
I know.
So.
Well, we'll get there,
Gene,
Mike.
if you're listening.
We'll get there. Anyway, I just want to say we certainly appreciate the feedback, and it helps. We hear stuff like that. It's like we got to keep doing these, and also too, like I know people will offer up ideas on things they want to hear, stuff like that. Super appreciative. We can't get to all of them, and there's some of them that we're just not experts in, and you don't want to hear us pontificate about.
That's what the Hawk Talks are for.
That's right.
So we'll bring on experts from time to time
That's
and talk to them, and where we have not the expertise, we'll bring them in.
That's right.
So, all right. Thank you for your time and listening. datacenterHawk.com for way more information than we could possibly give on a podcast. But check us out next time. See ya.